Welcome to Spot Check, the weekly video update series for the greatest unreality. I, your humble researcher, as always, am Nick Miser. So this week we are following up what I started last week, the series I've engineered about the background, some of the background theorists and ideas that have become pretty important for the study of role-playing games. And so last week we talked about Gregory Bateson and his idea of frames as interpretive ideas of how we understand certain given situations, and the message "this is play" as an example of a frame. And so this week we're talking about Erving Goffman, who expanded on all of these concepts. Erving Goffman is mostly remembered as a sociologist, but he actually did some sociology, some anthropology, and a mixture of other things, a little bit like Gregory Bateson in being somewhat interdisciplinary. Now, Goffman was really interested in games in his personal life, and he actually worked as a pit boss in Las Vegas at a casino for a while. But most of his work was actually about face-to-face communication, so how we present ourselves in various roles in our everyday lives, and how when we're just having a regular conversation, we assume the other person is taking certain roles and we're taking on certain roles and kind of doing what he calls face work and how we interact with people. But the most connected, the most important for the history and understanding of games is a work that he wrote called Frame Analysis, which is just a big, thick tome. And through a wonderful twist of fate that I always love, Frame Analysis actually came out in the same year as the original release of D&D, 1974. Although it might actually have been more fitting for the book to come out in 1979, since I think it's a lot more like the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide than the original release. So if you think of Bateson's ideas about frames that I talked about last week as kind of like the 1974 OD&D set, there's a lot of really revolutionary ideas in there, but they're not fully fleshed out in all the detail in what we talked about last week. So Frame Analysis is kind of like the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's full of all kinds of arcane terms and technical distinctions and kind of this sort of massive tome. So Gygax had weapon speed factors and all of those things that come up in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and Goffman had terms like up-keying and down-keying and transformation ambiguity and distinction upon distinction that he wants to make and is able to parse out in relation to how we deal with these different frames in our lives. And so just like in AD&D, sometimes frame analysis, technically, it might be a little too crunchy for its own good, too many little distinctions, but also, like AD&D, it means that there's a lot of really useful ideas that can be mined out of the overall system. So what I'm going to do today is just briefly go over a few of the key concepts that will be essential for understanding what Gary Fine does later when he applies this to D&D, and then we can kind of move forward from there into questions that I'm asking based on that work. So I'm going to go over the idea of laminations and keys. I'll start with keys. So for Goffman, he calls a key, and I'm going to quote him, "the set of conventions by which a given activity, one already meaningful in terms of some primary framework, is transformed into something patterned on this activity, but seen by the participants to be something quite else." So basically he's saying we have something that we're doing that is we interpret it in terms of our primary framework, talking to somebody. But then a key is like a key to a map, perhaps a dungeon map, that tells you how to interpret what you're seeing. So if you think back to the bang bang, or I guess it was pew pew, I shoot you. I'm doing a primary activity, which is moving my hand towards you, but you understand the key is make-believe, and so you can interpret that in a certain way and know how to understand what you're saying. So it's similar to frame, but what Goffman is saying is that there are sets of keys, almost like genres of frames that are common in our culture and in other cultures presumably too. He actually lays out 5 different common keys in Western culture, and the example that I'll use because it's most relevant to D&D is make-believe. So he describes make-believe as an activity that participants treat as an avowed, ostensible imitation or running through of a less transformed activity, this being done with a knowledge that nothing practical will come of the doing. So you can see, maybe if you've read the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, why I say that Goffman is kind of like the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, because he likes all these arcane terms like avowed, ostensible imitation. So basically he's saying, in make-believe, we know that we're supposed to take the activity that's being done, and we know that it's not going to do the practical thing that it looks like it's doing, and it's an imitation of something else that's less transformed in activity. So each of these keys are like laminations over our behavior, giving us more and more interpretive keys. And we can have laminations on top of laminations. And we always keep doing this as part of human interaction. And so we can have, not only can we pretend to be a dwarf cleric in a game session, but we can tell a story about our friend who pretended to be a dwarf cleric in a game session, and then also about how the dwarf cleric was in the game world pretending to be a halfling or what have you. And so laminations on laminations, it gets really complicated. So it's not surprising that, and a lot of what Goffman points out in here is that we often make mistakes in understanding what key we're supposed to be using in any given moment. And those can be moments of social kind of awkwardness in a conversation or in a presentation, any kind of social setting. If we're having problems with these frame interpretations, then it can create difficulties that we need to sort of then gloss over using our social skills or clarifications. So Goffman calls these misinterpretations, he calls them framing errors. And I actually have what I think is a pretty good example of a framing error and what that sounds like in a gaming session. The total clip is about a minute long, and all I have is the audio. But what I want to try and do is kind of a little experiment in the YouTube videos that I've done here and kind of do a play-by-play of this recording that I've done. So here's the first segment.
Large oaken studded door to your west, about 8 feet wide.
So this recording comes from a session that I played with Ernie Gygax at GaryCon a few years back. And so this initial clip here, we're just setting up the basic sort of your rigmarole, standard dungeon crawl, come up to a door, and he's describing it for us, primarily referring to the in-game frame or lamination of reality.
Check it. I'm going to listen first.
Is that percentage?
The listen is
Or
like
rather
6,
because
right?
with most things it's 6-sided die for
2 and 6 for an elf, I think, or 3 and 6.
Yeah, I was just thinking about using a thief and kind of.
Yeah, thieves do have
hear noise.
Hear noise.
Hear noise is 65%.
So now we've switched laminations. We're talking about the rules that determine whether or not we can hear what's on the other side of the door. That's a different lamination than thinking about the in-game reality.
All right, well,
It's awesome.
that's awesome. Yes, well, it's a little difficult.
I think it.
Because actually listen to your characters and play.
Your noise is 30%.
Oh, that's my hidden shadows. Fair enough. 30%.
Still on the level of the rules, I'm, in this clip that we just heard, correcting the thief. He read the wrong line on the sheet. And maybe I'm being an annoying rules lawyer, but that's what happened in the session. So there it is.
Sorry, guys.
Idiot, you're looking the wrong part.
I did my
That's what yours?
Pardon?
I did my other roles right, so that's good.
I thought you were saying that's what you heard. No, you idiot, you're looking at the wrong part.
Okay.
So there's the frame confusion. When Ernie is teasing me by saying, "No, you idiot, you're looking at the wrong part," and kind of teasing me about correcting Andrew's reading of his character sheet, Brian thinks that that's what his character heard on the other side of the door. So what Ernie meant at one lamination of reality, talking about the social level of our interaction, Brian interpreted as having more laminations than it actually had, as referring to the fictional reality of the game. So the basic takeaway here is that when we try to break down exactly what's going on in a D&D session, it gets really complicated really quickly. Now that I've covered the background of how Bateson and Goffman developed some of the concepts that help us think through that, next week I'm going to talk about how Gary Fine drew all of those concepts together in his analysis of D&D, and then we can talk about what questions that allows us to ask about D&D and gaming moving forward. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next week.